Wednesday morning, the Starbucks was busy. Surveillance video shows more than 20 people inside when two gunmen entered. They walk at first, then move quickly to the back. Several shots are fired. The two men then turn and run out.
Wednesday morning coffee turned deadly when 29 bullets shattered a Laval Starbucks, ending the life of Montreal's most connected underworld broker. Cheryl Lambos Theologue wasn't just another casualty in Quebec's crime wars. He was the man who made peace between enemies, moved millions in product, and kept the city's criminal ecosystem balanced. But when investigators traced the kill order back to a prison cell, they uncovered a betrayal that would redefine Montreal's underworld forever.
Now, the person who appears to have been the main target was shot and killed, a man in his 40s known on the streets as Bobby the Greek.
The man who connected everyone. Most people live their entire lives without understanding what real power looks like. Bobby the Greek figured it out by age 25, born Cheryl Lambos. Theologue in Montreal on February 26, 1983, he grew up watching the city's neighborhoods shift between languages, cultures, and most importantly, criminal territories. While other kids dreamed of becoming hockey players or doctors, Bobby learned something more valuable: how to make enemies need each other. By 2008, when most 25-year-olds were still figuring out their careers, Bobby had already positioned himself as something unprecedented in Montreal's crime scene. He wasn't a muscle guy breaking legs for collections. He wasn't a boss giving orders from behind bulletproof glass. He was the bridge that kept Montreal's fractured underworld from tearing itself apart completely. The city's criminal landscape had always been complicated, but Bobby understood complexity better than anyone. The Rudo crime family controlled traditional Italian organized crime operations. The Hells Angels, led by figures like Martin Rabier, dominated the biker scene with their own territories and rules. Meanwhile, street crews like Arab Power and Team Tupac Adna fought for corners and respect in neighborhoods where reputation meant survival. Most brokers pick a side and hope for protection. Bobby picked everyone and offered something better than protection: profit. He became the guy who could get a Hells Angels chapter to move Rudo family product without either side losing face. He arranged meetings between Arab power lieutenants and Italian-made men, brokering deals that kept money flowing and bodies from dropping. What made Bobby different wasn't just his connections. It was his understanding of what each group actually needed. The bikers needed product moving through routes they couldn't access directly. The Italian families needed street-level distribution networks without the headaches of managing corner crews. The street gangs needed suppliers who could deliver quantity and quality without the drama that came with territorial disputes. For over a decade, Bobby threaded this needle perfectly. Police files from 2010 to 2020 show his name appearing in surveillance reports, but never as a primary target. He was always the guy in the background, the one making introductions, smoothing over problems before they became bloodbaths. Detectives knew what he did, but proving it was nearly impossible. He never touched product directly, never issued orders, never threatened anyone. He just made phone calls and somehow deals happened. But as investigators would later discover, being indispensable to everyone eventually makes you a threat to everyone. Because the same connections that made Bobby valuable would ultimately make him too dangerous to keep alive. Montreal's shifting ground.
On June 12th and have pled not guilty to the charges.
They were involved in every crime possible.
Everything changed on December 23, 2013, when Vito Russo died. To outsiders, it looked like natural causes ending the life of an aging crime boss. To insiders, it was the beginning of a power vacuum that would reshape Montreal's underworld for the next decade. Vito had been more than just a leader. He was an institution. His word ended disputes before they started wars. His approval meant protection that reached across family lines and even into rival organizations. Most importantly, Vito understood that Montreal's crime scene worked best when it worked together. Competition was inevitable, but complete destruction served nobody's interests. His son, Leonardo Rudo, inherited the throne, but not the universal respect that came with it. Leo was younger, hungrier, and had ideas about expanding operations that made the old-school members nervous. More problematically, He had enemies his father had managed to keep in check through careful diplomacy and strategic intimidation. Within months of Vito's death, the careful balance started shifting. Old agreements needed renegotiation. Territory lines that had remained stable for years suddenly became contested. Most dangerously, the younger generation in every organization started questioning why they should honor deals made by dead men. This was exactly the kind of chaos Bobby had built his career managing. As the Rudo family struggled to maintain authority, other groups sensed opportunity. The Hells Angels began pushing into areas they'd previously respected as off-limits. Street crews like Arab Power and Team Tupac Adna started forming alliances with whoever offered the best terms, regardless of historical loyalties. For Bobby, this instability represented both opportunity and danger. More conflict meant more need for his services as groups scrambled to form new alliances and test new boundaries. But it also meant the old rules that had protected him were breaking down along with everything else. The first real warning sign came in early 2014 when a routine debt collection between a Rudo associate and an Arab Power lieutenant escalated into a shooting. In the old days, Vito would have made a phone call, Bobby would have arranged a sit-down, and the problem would have disappeared before it made the news. Instead, it took 3 weeks and 2 more bodies before the situation cooled down. Bobby managed to broker a peace deal, but everyone involved noticed how much harder it had become. The automatic respect for neutral ground was eroding. The assumption that certain people couldn't be touched was weakening. Most importantly, the idea that some conflicts were bad for everyone's business was losing its power to prevent violence. By 2015, Bobby was working harder than ever just to maintain the status quo. His phone rang constantly with calls from lieutenants asking him to fix problems that kept getting more complicated and more personal. The generous fees he'd always charged for his services started looking less like luxury payments and more like hazard pay. But the real danger wasn't coming from the chaos around him. It was coming from the fact that as Montreal's underworld became more unstable, Bobby was becoming more essential to keeping it functional. And in a world where power is everything, being indispensable to everyone eventually makes you a threat to everyone. The broker's golden years, between 2016 and 2020, Bobby the Greek reached the peak of his influence in Montreal's underworld. While other cities saw their crime organizations tear each other apart in bloody succession wars, Montreal remained relatively stable, not because the different groups had learned to love each other, but because Bobby had perfected the art of making everyone's problems profitable for everyone else. His operation had evolved far beyond simple message passing. Bobby ran what amounted to a criminal consulting firm, complete with specialists for different types of problems. Need to move a shipment through territory controlled by a rival group. Bobby knew which palms to grease and which conversations needed to happen. Having trouble with a street crew that was muscling in on established operations? Bobby could arrange a meeting where everyone walked away with something they wanted. The fees he charged reflected the value he provided. A simple introduction between 2 groups might cost $10,000. Brokering a major drug shipment deal could bring him $100,000 or more. Most importantly, his success rate was nearly perfect. When Bobby arranged something, it happened smoothly. When he promised a problem would stay quiet, it stayed buried. Police surveillance from this period shows just how deeply embedded Bobby had become in Montreal's criminal ecosystem. His phone records revealed contacts with over 200 known associates of organized crime groups. His travel patterns showed him moving freely between neighborhoods that were essentially war zones for anyone else without the right connections. His bank accounts, the ones investigators could track, showed deposits that would have made some legitimate business executives jealous. But Bobby's real power wasn't measured in money, it was measured in respect. Street crews that would have shot each other on sight were willing to sit at the same table if Bobby vouched for the meeting's legitimacy. Hells Angels members who trusted almost nobody outside their own chapters were comfortable doing business through Bobby's introductions. Even federal law enforcement agencies grudgingly admitted that Montreal's crime scene was more manageable when Bobby was keeping the peace. The COVID-19 pandemic actually strengthened his position. While legitimate businesses struggled with lockdowns and restrictions, criminal organizations needed more coordination than ever to keep their operations running. Drug shipments required more complex routes. Money laundering became more complicated with increased banking scrutiny. Most importantly, the usual face-to-face meetings that kept criminal alliances stable became dangerous for health and security reasons. Bobby adapted faster than anyone else. He organized secure communication networks that allowed different groups to coordinate without meeting in person. He arranged for neutral warehouses where product could be transferred without territorial complications. He even developed protocols for settling disputes through intermediaries when direct contact wasn't possible. By 2021, Bobby wasn't just a broker anymore, he was infrastructure. Montreal's underworld had become dependent on his services to function efficiently. Drug routes, money flows, territorial agreements, and conflict resolution all flowed through networks he had created and maintained. This success brought him luxuries that would have been unthinkable for someone in his position just a few years earlier. He owned property in multiple provinces, drove cars worth more than most people's houses, and traveled internationally without worrying about who might be watching. His personal security detail included former military personnel and ex-police officers. Most tellingly, he was comfortable enough to maintain regular routines, including that daily coffee at the same Starbucks in Laval. But success had also brought him something far more dangerous than luxury: independence. By 2022, Bobby was making decisions about criminal operations that affected millions of dollars in illegal activity. The groups he served still paid him enormous fees, but they were also realizing that they needed him more than he needed any of them individually. In Montreal's underworld, being needed is an asset. Being indispensable is a liability. And being independent enough to make your own rules is a death sentence that just hasn't been carried out yet. Cracks in the foundation, the first signs that Bobby's world was shifting, came in subtle changes that only someone with his experience would notice. Phone calls that used to be returned within hours started taking days. Meetings that had always been face-to-face moved to public places with lots of witnesses. Most telling, the jokes and casual conversation that had always preceded business discussions started disappearing from his interactions with longtime contacts. In early 2022, Bobby began hearing his own name in contexts that made him uncomfortable. Street-level dealers were telling their friends they knew Bobby's guy as if proximity to his network was a status symbol. Younger members of established organizations were name-dropping him to impress each other, not realizing that in the underworld, having your name on too many lips usually means it's about to be on a tombstone. More concerning were the questions that started reaching him through intermediaries. Not questions about services he could provide, but questions about his own activities. Which routes was he using for his personal interests? How much was he actually earning from the deals he brokered? Most dangerously, were there any arrangements he'd made that his usual contacts didn't know about? The reality was that Bobby had started making side deals, not massive operations that would threaten anyone's core business, but smaller arrangements that bypassed some of the traditional hierarchies he'd always respected. A direct connection between an Arab power crew and a Hell's Angels supplier that didn't go through Rudo family approval. A money laundering service for street crews that used channels he'd developed independently. These weren't betrayals in the traditional sense. Bobby wasn't working for law enforcement, wasn't stealing from his clients, wasn't playing different groups against each other for his own benefit. He was just exercising the kind of business independence that would be completely normal in any legitimate industry. In the underworld, normal business independence is the first step toward being seen as a threat. The situation escalated in spring 2022, when a deal Bobby had arranged went sideways in a way that cost one of his clients serious money. A shipment that was supposed to move smoothly through multiple territories got intercepted by police, not because of anything Bobby did wrong, but because one of the smaller crews he'd connected to the deal had someone talking to law enforcement. In the legitimate business world, this would have been an unfortunate coincidence that everyone would work together to avoid repeating. In Montreal's underworld, it became evidence that Bobby's expanding network was creating security risks that the traditional hierarchies couldn't control. The response was swift and sophisticated. Bobby's phone started carrying conversations that he didn't initiate, with people asking about details of operations they shouldn't have known about. His movements were being tracked more carefully than ever before. not just by law enforcement, but by people within his own network. Most ominously, he began receiving offers to buy him out of certain territories and operations, offers that came with implications about what would happen if he declined. By fall 2022, Bobby was facing a choice he'd managed to avoid for over a decade: pick a side or become everyone's problem. The Rudo family was making it clear that his independence was creating complications for their operations. The Hells Angels were questioning whether his expanding network was worth the security risks it introduced. Even some of the street crews he'd been helping were worried that his high profile was bringing unwanted attention to their activities. But Bobby had spent too many years being his own boss to start taking orders from anyone else. Instead of scaling back his operations, he doubled down on independence. He hired better security, developed more sophisticated communication protocols, and started building relationships with organizations outside Montreal that could provide backup if his local support network collapsed. This was exactly the kind of escalation that Montreal's established powers had been afraid of. Bobby wasn't just a broker anymore. He was trying to become a power in his own right. And in a criminal ecosystem that had spent decades maintaining careful balances, anyone who upset those balances had to be corrected before they brought down the whole system. The correction would come in the form of 29 bullets fired in less than 2 minutes at a Laval Starbucks. But before that final moment, there would be months of careful planning, encrypted messages bouncing between prison cells and street corners, and a betrayal so complete that Bobby never saw it coming until the door opened and 2 masked men walked in. The warning signs, spring 2023, brought changes that should have told Bobby everything he needed to know about how quickly his world was closing in. The most obvious signal came from his oldest contacts, the people who had been doing business with him since his early days as a simple message carrier between rival groups. These weren't enemies making threats or competitors trying to muscle in on his territory. These were friends, or what passed for friends in Montreal's underworld, who started asking questions that felt more like interrogations. How many operations was he running that they didn't know about? Were there any deals he'd made that hadn't gone through proper channels? Most pointedly, did he think he might be getting too big for his own safety? The questions came wrapped in concern, delivered by people who claimed to be worried about his welfare. But Bobby had spent too many years listening to the subtext in criminal conversations to miss what was really being communicated. These weren't wellness checks. They were intelligence-gathering operations designed to figure out how much of a problem he'd become and what it would take to solve that problem permanently. Around the same time, his routine surveillance started noticing the same cars appearing in different locations throughout his daily activities. Not just police surveillance, which he'd learned to spot and avoid years earlier, but private security that moved with the kind of discipline that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. Someone was mapping his patterns with the kind of thoroughness that usually preceded either an arrest or an assassination. Bobby's response was to beef up his own security and vary his routines more dramatically than he'd ever done before. He started traveling with 2 bodyguards instead of 1, both chosen for their experience with organized crime security rather than simple muscle. He invested in a bulletproof Escalade and had his primary residences swept for surveillance devices monthly. But the most telling change was in how his business operations were being treated by the organizations he'd served for over a decade. Deals that should have been routine started requiring additional approvals from higher levels of leadership. Meetings that had always been simple coordination sessions began including participants he didn't recognize, people whose only apparent purpose was to observe and report back to their superiors. Most ominously, some of his most lucrative ongoing arrangements started being questioned by clients who had never shown any interest in operational details before. Why was he using certain routes instead of others? How had he developed relationships with suppliers they hadn't approved? Were there any aspects of his operations that they should know about for security reasons? These questions revealed something Bobby had perhaps been too successful to notice. He'd become so integral to Montreal's criminal operations that everyone involved had started seeing him as a potential weak point rather than a valuable asset. His knowledge of everyone's business made him invaluable, but it also made him dangerous if that knowledge ever ended up in the wrong hands. The situation reached a critical point in June 2023, when Bobby learned through back channels that there had been meetings about him that he hadn't been invited to attend. Not meetings to plan operations he would broker, but meetings to discuss what to do about him as a strategic problem. Representatives from the Rudo family, Hell's Angels leadership, and even some of the larger street crews had been talking about Bobby's situation without including him in the conversation. For someone whose entire career had been built on being the person who facilitated communication between these groups, being excluded from discussions about his own future represented a fundamental shift in how he was being perceived. He wasn't just another service provider anymore, he was a problem that needed to be solved. Bobby's response was to accelerate his efforts at independence, reaching out to criminal organizations in Toronto and Vancouver to develop alternative support networks that would be outside Montreal's established power structures. He also began moving some of his assets offshore and setting up communication systems that would be harder for local groups to monitor or intercept. But every step he took toward independence confirmed what his former clients had already decided. Bobby the Greek had become too powerful to control and too dangerous to allow to continue operating freely. The man who had spent over a decade preventing wars in Montreal's underworld was about to become the target of one. The only question remaining was whether the kill order would come from the street or from behind prison walls. As investigators would later discover, it came from both, coordinated with the kind of precision that Bobby had once brought to his own operations. The final weeks, August 2023, marked the beginning of the end for Bobby the Greek, though he spent those weeks believing he was finally taking control of his own destiny. His contacts in Toronto had agreed to help him establish operations that would be independent of Montreal's traditional hierarchies. His offshore financial arrangements were progressing smoothly. Most importantly, he'd identified several younger associates who could help him build a new kind of criminal organization, one that would be more flexible and less dependent on the aging power structures that had dominated Quebec's underworld for decades. What Bobby didn't realize was that his efforts at independence were being monitored not just by law enforcement, but by a coalition of his former clients who had decided that his expansion plans represented an unacceptable threat to their established operations. Every phone call to Toronto was being recorded. Every financial transaction was being tracked. Every meeting with potential new associates was being reported back to the very people he was trying to move away from. The surveillance wasn't casual or opportunistic. It was systematic and professional, conducted by people with access to resources that rivaled law enforcement capabilities. Former police officers and military personnel, the same kinds of people Bobby had hired for his own security, were being used to build a comprehensive picture of his activities and plans. More troubling were the messages that started reaching him through intermediaries, communications that were clearly designed to gauge his loyalty and intentions. Questions about whether he was planning to relocate his primary operations outside Montreal. Inquiries about his relationships with law enforcement agencies. Most pointedly, suggestions that his success had perhaps made him forget where his loyalties should lie. Bobby's responses to these probes were carefully crafted to be reassuring without being submissive. He emphasized his continued commitment to his long-time business relationships while asserting his right to expand operations in ways that would benefit everyone involved. He offered to bring his new contacts into existing arrangements rather than running parallel operations. But his efforts at diplomacy were undermined by intelligence his former clients were gathering about his actual activities. They knew he was developing independent revenue streams. They knew he was building relationships with organizations that hadn't been approved by Montreal's established leadership. Most dangerously, they knew he was positioning himself to be less dependent on their continued cooperation. September brought escalation in the form of economic pressure designed to test Bobby's resolve and limit his options. Several of his most lucrative ongoing arrangements were suddenly terminated or restructured in ways that reduced his role and his compensation. Credit lines he'd maintained with various criminal enterprises were quietly closed. Most significantly, he began losing access to some of the communication networks and transportation resources that had made his operations efficient and secure. These moves weren't presented as punishment or retaliation. They were framed as normal business adjustments in response to changing market conditions. But Bobby understood their real purpose: to make him financially dependent on the goodwill of the same organizations he was trying to gain independence from. His response was to accelerate his timeline for establishing alternative operations. Instead of the gradual transition he'd originally planned, Bobby began making moves that were necessarily more visible and more aggressive. He started offering services to clients his former partners hadn't approved, using resources and contacts they hadn't been informed about. This escalation gave his opponents exactly what they needed to justify more drastic action. Bobby wasn't just pursuing independence anymore. He was actively competing with the same organizations that had made his success possible in the first place. In their view, he had crossed the line from valuable partner to dangerous rival. October 2023 opened with Bobby receiving what amounted to a final warning, delivered through one of his oldest and most trusted contacts. The message was simple: scale back the independent operations, return to his traditional role as a broker between established organizations, and everything could go back to the way it had been for over a decade. But Bobby had gone too far to turn back. His new operations were already generating substantial revenue and would provide the foundation for long-term independence from Montreal's traditional criminal hierarchies. More importantly, accepting the demand would have meant admitting that he'd never actually been as powerful or secure as he'd believed. His refusal to comply was delivered politely but firmly. He appreciated the concern, but he was confident that his expanded operations would ultimately benefit everyone involved. He was willing to negotiate specific arrangements to address any legitimate concerns, but he wasn't willing to abandon the strategic direction that would secure his long-term position in Quebec's criminal landscape. That message, sent on October 2, 2023, effectively signed his death warrant. Within hours of its delivery, encrypted communications were flowing between prison cells and street corners, between Hells Angels clubhouses and Rudo family safehouses. The decision had been made. Bobby the Greek had become too independent to tolerate and too dangerous to ignore. The only remaining question was when and where the correction would be administered. The answer would come 48 hours later, at 10:31 a.m., in a Laval Starbucks, where Bobby had been having coffee every Wednesday morning for the past 2 years. October 4th, the last morning. Bobby woke up on October 4th, 2023, in his Laval condo the same way he'd been waking up for months, checking his phone for messages that might indicate how his day was going to unfold. The previous few weeks had been tense, but not unusually so for someone in his position. Criminal operations always involved uncertainty and risk management. The key was distinguishing between normal operational stress and genuine threats to personal safety. That morning, his phone showed the usual collection of business-related messages, requests for services, and coordination communications for ongoing operations. Nothing suggested that this Wednesday would be different from the hundreds of other Wednesdays when he'd driven the same route to the same Starbucks to conduct the same kinds of conversations that had made him wealthy and powerful. His security routine, which had become more elaborate over the past year, involved checking with both of his bodyguards before leaving the condo. These weren't street muscle hired for intimidation. They were experienced professionals with military and law enforcement backgrounds who understood the sophisticated threats that someone in Bobby's position faced. Their assessment that morning was that surveillance activity around his residence had been normal, with no unusual vehicles or personnel in the area. The drive from his condo to the Starbucks on Boulevard St. Martin West normally took about 15 minutes, depending on traffic. Bobby's usual pattern was to vary his route slightly from day to day, but always to arrive at the coffee shop between 10:25 and 10:35 a.m. This timing allowed him to conduct whatever business conversations he had scheduled while avoiding the peak morning rush that made surveillance more difficult and escape routes more complicated. What Bobby didn't know was that his routine had been studied and mapped by people with access to resources that rivaled law enforcement surveillance capabilities. Every variation in his route had been noted and accounted for. The timing of his arrival had been calculated to within a few minutes. Most critically, the layout of the Starbucks and its surrounding parking area had been analyzed to identify optimal positioning for both the shooters and their escape vehicle. The black SUV that would serve as the assassination team's transportation had been stolen 3 days earlier from a parking lot in Montreal's West End. The theft had been carried out by professionals who understood how to take vehicles without triggering immediate police attention. And the SUV had been stored in a garage that couldn't be traced back to any of the people who would actually carry out the hit, if escape became necessary. His security team had checked the route earlier and found nothing unusual. No vehicles that suggested surveillance, no personnel who appeared to be conducting reconnaissance. At 10:25 a.m., Bobby's Escalade pulled into the Starbucks parking lot. His usual parking space near the front entrance, but with clear sight lines to multiple exit routes, was available. One bodyguard remained in the vehicle, while Bobby and the second bodyguard entered the coffee shop. This was their standard procedure for what they considered to be low-risk situations in familiar locations. Bobby ordered his usual small black coffee and took his usual seat near the window. His bodyguard positioned himself at a corner table with clear views of both the entrance and Bobby's location. To any casual observer, they looked like two men having coffee while conducting some kind of business meeting. What none of them noticed was that the black SUV circling the parking lot wasn't conducting casual surveillance. It was confirming final details for an operation that had been planned with military-level precision. The timing of Bobby's arrival, his choice of seating, the positioning of his security, all of it matched the intelligence that had been gathered over months of careful observation. At 10:30 a.m., Bobby was checking messages on his phone, perhaps responding to one of the business communications he'd received that morning. His coffee was still steaming. His bodyguard was alert, but not visibly concerned. The other customers in the Starbucks were going about their normal routines, unaware that they were about to become witnesses to one of Montreal's most significant organized crime assassinations. The black SUV completed its final circle of the parking lot and pulled into a position that would allow for rapid departure while providing the shooters with direct access to their target. Two men stepped out, both wearing dark clothing and masks that would prevent identification while allowing for clear vision and communication during the operation. As they approached the entrance to the Starbucks, Bobby was still focused on his phone, still operating under the assumption that his morning routine was just another day in a career that had made him wealthy and powerful while keeping him relatively safe for over a decade. He was wrong about the safety part. At 10:31 a.m., the door opened, and everything Bobby had built over 15 years of careful relationship management and strategic positioning was about to be erased in less than 2 minutes. 29 rounds in 2 minutes.
Surveillance video shows more than 20 people inside when two gunmen entered. They walk at first, then move quickly to the back.
The door chime at 10:31 a.m. was the last normal sound anyone in that Starbucks would remember clearly. Two men entered with the kind of controlled calm that comes from extensive planning and professional training. They weren't rushing, weren't showing the nervousness that might be expected from people about to commit murder in broad daylight. They moved with the precision of people executing a carefully rehearsed plan. The first shooter headed directly toward Bobby's table, while the second positioned himself to control the exit and monitor for any unexpected complications. Neither man said anything, issued any warnings, or showed any hesitation. They had come to complete a specific task, and everything about their behavior indicated they intended to finish it quickly and efficiently. Bobby looked up from his phone, and for just a moment there might have been recognition in his expression. Not recognition of the specific individuals, their masks prevented that, but perhaps recognition of what was about to happen. Someone who had spent 15 years navigating Montreal's criminal underworld would have understood the significance of two masked men entering his regular coffee spot with obvious hostile intent. His bodyguard reacted immediately, reaching for his weapon while simultaneously moving to position himself between Bobby and the shooters. But the distance was too great, and the attackers were too well prepared for defensive action to be effective. The first shots were fired before anyone in the coffee shop could process what was happening, let alone respond to it. The sound of automatic gunfire in an enclosed space is overwhelming in ways that movies and television never capture accurately. The physical impact of that much noise in a small area is disorienting enough, but combined with the visual chaos of muzzle flashes, breaking glass, and people diving for cover, it creates a sensory overload that makes detailed observation almost impossible. What witnesses later described was more impressionistic than specific. the smell of gunpowder mixing with coffee, the sound of glass and ceramic breaking, screaming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The actual sequence of events, who was shot first, how many rounds were fired at each target, how long the entire incident lasted, had to be reconstructed from physical evidence rather than eyewitness accounts. Forensic analysis later determined that 29 rounds were fired from 2 modified Glock 18 handguns, weapons that had been converted to fully automatic fire. This wasn't random street violence or a crime of passion. The weapons, like everything else about the operation, indicated careful planning and professional execution. Bobby was hit multiple times while still seated at his table. His bodyguard was struck twice while attempting to return fire, though he never managed to discharge his own weapon. The second bodyguard, who had remained in the parking lot with the Escalade, was shot as he attempted to enter the building in response to the gunfire. The entire shooting lasted approximately 90 seconds. When it was over, 2 men were dead and 1 was critically wounded. The shooters left the same way they had entered, calmly, professionally, without any apparent concern about witnesses or surveillance cameras. They walked to their SUV, drove out of the parking lot, and disappeared into Montreal traffic. By the time police arrived at 10:33 a.m., the Starbucks looked like a war zone. Shattered glass covered everything, blood was pooled around Bobby's table, and traumatized customers were still hiding behind overturned furniture. But the shooters were already miles away, and their escape vehicle was about to become another piece of evidence in what would become one of Quebec's most complex organized crime investigations. The black SUV was found burning in Rivière-des-Prairies 20 minutes after the shooting, reduced to a metal skeleton that destroyed most of the physical evidence that might have identified the perpetrators. But the fire didn't destroy everything, and what remained would provide investigators with their first clues about who had ordered Bobby's assassination and why. Most importantly, the precision and coordination of the entire operation, from the months of surveillance to the professional execution to the immediate destruction of evidence, indicated that this wasn't a spontaneous act of violence or even a simple contract killing. This was a strategic elimination carried out by people with access to significant resources and sophisticated planning capabilities. The question investigators faced wasn't just who had killed Bobby the Greek, but who had the power and motivation to organize such an elaborate operation. The answer would lead them into the highest levels of Montreal's criminal hierarchies and ultimately to prison cells where aging crime bosses were still issuing orders that could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. Following the trail, the investigation into Bobby's assassination began with physical evidence, but quickly expanded into something much more complex. When investigators realized they weren't just dealing with a contract killing, they were looking at a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Montreal's organized crime families. The burned SUV in Rivière-des-Prairies provided the first breakthrough. Despite the fire damage, forensic specialists were able to recover partial fingerprints from the interior and trace elements of the accelerant used to destroy the vehicle. The gasoline-acetone mixture was identical to compounds found in at least 3 other vehicle fires connected to organized crime activities since 2020, suggesting the same people had been involved in multiple operations. More significantly, the location where the SUV was abandoned wasn't random. Rivière-des-Prairies had been used for similar purposes by criminal organizations with connections to both the Rudo family and Hells Angels operations. The choice of this specific area indicated familiarity with local criminal practices and access to resources that could ensure the vehicle's destruction without interference. Cell phone data from towers around both the Starbucks and the burn site provided even more valuable intelligence. One number kept appearing in communications immediately before, during, and after the assassination. A prepaid phone registered under a false identity, but linked to known associates of the Rudo crime family. Most intriguingly, that same number had been in contact with phones registered to inmates inside Bordeaux prison in the days leading up to Bobby's murder. The timing and pattern of these communications suggested coordination between people inside the correctional facility and those who had carried out the actual assassination. Within 48 hours of Bobby's death, the investigation had been classified as organized crime-related and transferred to a joint task force that included both provincial and federal law enforcement agencies. The level of planning and coordination evident in the assassination suggested involvement by criminal organizations with capabilities that local police weren't equipped to investigate independently. Encrypted message traffic intercepted through ongoing surveillance operations provided additional pieces of the puzzle. References to window closing and work finished appeared in communications between known Rudo associates immediately after the shooting. Most telling was a message sent from inside Bordeaux prison just hours after Bobby's death. Problem solved, balance restored. The investigation team's focus shifted from identifying the shooters to understanding who had ordered the assassination and why. The physical evidence was important, but the real story was in the power structures and personal relationships that had made Bobby's murder necessary from someone's perspective. Interviews with Bobby's known associates revealed a pattern of increasing isolation in the months before his death. People who had done business with him for years reported that he'd become more secretive about his operations, more concerned about surveillance, and more focused on developing relationships outside Montreal's traditional criminal hierarchies. This information corroborated intelligence that law enforcement had been gathering through their own surveillance operations. Bobby had indeed been expanding his activities beyond the role of broker and facilitator that had made him valuable to established crime families. He was developing independent revenue streams and building relationships with organizations that hadn't been approved by Montreal's criminal leadership. From the perspective of groups like the Rudo family and Hell's Angels, Bobby's expanding independence represented a threat that went beyond simple business competition. His detailed knowledge of their operations, combined with his growing autonomy, made him a potential security risk that couldn't be managed through traditional means of control and intimidation. The investigation team's working theory was that Bobby's assassination had been ordered by a coalition of criminal organizations who saw his independence as a threat to their established operations. But proving this theory would require evidence that connected specific individuals to specific decisions, and that evidence was protected by layers of security and silence that even law enforcement's most sophisticated investigative techniques struggled to penetrate. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A prisoner inside Bordeaux who had been cooperating with authorities on an unrelated case overheard conversations that provided direct insight into how Bobby's assassination had been planned and approved. The prison connection. The revelation that Bobby's assassination had been ordered from inside Bordeaux prison fundamentally changed how investigators understood both the murder itself and the power dynamics of Montreal's organized crime scene. This wasn't just a contract killing carried out by professional shooters. It was a strategic decision made by incarcerated leaders who still exercised operational control over criminal enterprises on the outside. The key breakthrough came from intercepted communications between Leonardo Rudo, serving time for racketeering and conspiracy charges, and several of his most trusted lieutenants who were also incarcerated in the same facility. These weren't casual conversations about general criminal activities. They were specific planning sessions for eliminating what the participants referred to as the Greek problem. Court documents later revealed that prison authorities had been monitoring these communications as part of ongoing investigations into organized crime activities being coordinated from inside correctional facilities. But the significance of what they were hearing didn't become clear until after Bobby's assassination, when investigators could match the timing and content of intercepted messages with the actual events surrounding his murder. The most damaging piece of evidence was a recording of Leonardo Rudo explaining to another inmate why Bobby needed to be eliminated. According to the transcript, Bobby had forgotten his place and was acting like he owned what belonged to other people. More specifically, Rudo said that Bobby's independent operations were creating security risks that threatened the entire organizational structure that kept Montreal's criminal activities profitable and protected from law enforcement interference. But the decision to kill Bobby wasn't made unilaterally by the Rudo family. Prison communications revealed extensive consultations with representatives of other criminal organizations, including Hell's Angels leadership and senior members of various street crews. The goal wasn't just to eliminate a perceived threat. It was to send a message that would reinforce traditional hierarchies and discourage similar independence by other criminal entrepreneurs. The coordination required for this kind of multi-organizational decision-making was possible because many of Quebec's most senior criminal leaders were incarcerated in the same facility. Bordeaux Prison had effectively become a headquarters for organized crime planning, where inmates could meet regularly and communicate freely without the surveillance and security concerns that made similar coordination difficult on the outside. Federal investigators discovered that the prison's internal communication systems had been compromised to allow for encrypted messaging between inmates and their external associates. Cell phones and other prohibited communication devices were being smuggled into the facility with the cooperation of corrupted correctional staff. Most significantly, meetings between inmates from different criminal organizations were being facilitated by prison administrators who either didn't understand or didn't care about the security implications. The actual kill order was transmitted through this network on October 2nd, 2023, just 2 days before Bobby's assassination. The message was simple but specific. Window opens Wednesday morning, usual place, clean finish. This communication was relayed through multiple intermediaries to avoid direct connections between the inmates who ordered the killing and the people who carried it out. Investigators were able to trace this communication chain through cell phone records, encrypted messaging logs, and financial transactions that showed payments flowing from accounts controlled by organized crime families to individuals with no apparent legitimate connection to those organizations. The money trail confirmed that Bobby's assassination was a professional contract killing funded and directed by incarcerated criminal leaders. More troubling was the discovery that this wasn't an isolated incident. Prison communications revealed references to other corrections that had been ordered and carried out over the past several years, suggesting that Quebec's correctional system had become a nerve center for ongoing criminal operations, rather than a place where criminal leaders were isolated from their organizations. The Bobby the Greek assassination was just the most visible example of how incarcerated crime bosses continued to exercise operational control over activities on the outside. His murder wasn't just about eliminating a perceived threat. It was about demonstrating that traditional criminal hierarchies remained intact despite the incarceration of their leadership. This realization led to a broader investigation into how organized crime operations were being coordinated from inside Quebec's correctional facilities. What investigators found was a systematic compromise of prison security that had allowed criminal organizations to maintain operational effectiveness despite the imprisonment of their senior leadership. But understanding who had ordered Bobby's assassination was only part of the story. The more complex question was why his former partners and clients had decided that killing him was preferable to continuing the business relationships that had made everyone involved wealthy and powerful for over a decade. The real motive. The decision to assassinate Bobby the Greek wasn't made impulsively or emotionally. It was the result of a careful cost-benefit analysis by criminal organizations that had concluded his continued operation posed unacceptable risks to their long-term interests. Understanding this calculation requires examining not just what Bobby had done wrong, but how the criminal landscape in Montreal had evolved to make his traditional role obsolete and his independence threatening. For over a decade, Bobby's value had been based on his ability to facilitate cooperation between criminal organizations that were natural competitors or enemies. His services reduced conflict, increased efficiency, and allowed different groups to maximize profits while minimizing the kinds of violent confrontations that attracted law enforcement attention and disrupted business operations. But by 2023, several factors had combined to make Bobby's broker role less valuable and his independence more problematic. First, the criminal organizations he'd been serving had become more sophisticated in their own right, developing internal capabilities that reduced their dependence on external facilitators. The Rudo family had cultivated direct relationships with suppliers and distributors that eliminated the need for Bobby's introductions. Hells Angels chapters had established their own territorial agreements that didn't require external mediation. Second, law enforcement pressure had increased significantly, making the kind of inter-organizational cooperation that Bobby specialized in more dangerous than profitable. Police agencies had become much more effective at using surveillance and intelligence gathering to identify and prosecute the kinds of complex conspiracies that Bobby's services enabled. His detailed knowledge of multiple criminal operations made him a particularly attractive target for law enforcement efforts to develop comprehensive cases against organized crime activities. Third, and most importantly, Bobby had begun using his accumulated knowledge and contacts to compete directly with the same organizations that had made his career possible. His independent operations weren't just supplementary income, they were alternative business models that bypassed traditional criminal hierarchies and reduced the profits available to established organizations. From the perspective of criminal leaders like Leonardo Rudo, Bobby had evolved from a valuable service provider to a dangerous competitor who possessed inside knowledge of their operations and vulnerabilities. His success in developing independent revenue streams demonstrated that other criminal entrepreneurs could potentially follow the same path, undermining the monopolistic control that traditional crime families had exercised over lucrative criminal markets. The final factor that sealed Bobby's fate was his apparent belief that his value to multiple organizations provided him with protection from any single group. This assumption might have been accurate when his services were essential and his operations were supplementary to rather than competitive with established criminal enterprises. But once he became a competitor rather than a facilitator, his knowledge of multiple organizations' activities made him a threat to everyone involved. The decision to eliminate Bobby was complicated by the fact that he maintained valuable relationships with multiple criminal organizations. Killing him risked disrupting operations that were still profitable and potentially triggering conflicts between groups that had been cooperating peacefully. The solution was to ensure that his assassination was coordinated between all affected parties, so that no single organization would be blamed for eliminating a mutual asset. Prison communications revealed extensive negotiations between different criminal organizations about how to handle the Greek situation. These discussions weren't about whether Bobby should be eliminated. That decision had already been made. They were about ensuring that his removal wouldn't disrupt the broader cooperative relationships that kept Montreal's criminal ecosystem stable and profitable. The timing of the assassination was also strategic, designed to occur after Bobby had committed to expansion plans that made retreat impossible while before those plans could be fully implemented. Killing him after he'd burned bridges with traditional criminal organizations, but before he'd established sufficient independence, ensured that his operations would collapse rather than being transferred to potential successors. Most cynically, Bobby's assassination served as a demonstration of power that would discourage similar independence by other criminal entrepreneurs. The message wasn't subtle. Cooperation with established hierarchies would be rewarded, but attempts at independence would be punished with extreme prejudice. The public nature of the killing, carried out in broad daylight at a location associated with Bobby's regular routine, was intended to maximize the deterrent effect on other potential competitors. This calculated brutality revealed something important about how Montreal's organized crime scene had evolved since the death of Vito Russo in 2013. The old model of personal relationships and individual respect had been replaced by corporate-style decision-making based on strategic calculations rather than emotional factors. Bobby wasn't killed because anyone hated him personally. He was eliminated because his continued existence had become bad for business. Understanding this shift from personal to strategic motivations helps explain not just why Bobby was killed, but how Montreal's criminal organizations had adapted to changing law enforcement pressures and market conditions while maintaining their operational effectiveness and territorial control.